Welcome, you guys. Thanks for joining. I'm going to give us a minute here just to let everybody kind of trickle in over the course of the next couple minutes. Today, as you guys know, we're presenting AP US History. I'm guessing most of you guys are probably juniors. That's sort of the most common year to take it. Maybe some of you guys have studied independently for it if your school doesn't offer the AP level for whatever reason. Um, But yes, rest assured, we will cover everything, whether you've seen it in school, whether you've been working on it all year, or if it's been more so something you've been doing independently. So, by way of introduction, my name is Nick. It's sort of my tutoring moniker is the college lad. So I do most of my tutoring with Wyzant, and I do a lot of these presentations with these guys as well. My primary tutoring is actually SATs and ACTs, but as a natural extension of that, a lot of the same test prep skills and test taking skills come into play on the multiple choice portion of this test. And I think that with sort of a strong strategic approach on the AP exams, you can really help yourself a lot. I know one thing that I see all the time with my students is that they know the material extremely, extremely well, but unfortunately, they're kind of leaving points on the table here and there, especially in the free response section, just if nothing else, through a lack of familiarity with how it's scored and really how rigidly it's scored and going along with what exactly the test is looking for, not wasting your energy doing things that aren't going to help you very much. Um, okay, cool. So I think I'm going to start diving in. We'll let the last couple people trickle in as we go along. So I'm going to start off with just the overall test format here. Now, if this is your first AP exam, you guys are going to be familiar. I'm sorry, if this is not your first AP exam, this will probably be familiar to you. The sort of overall look and feel of how this is broken up, particularly among the humanities exams, where you start out with a group of multiple choice questions, then you move on to the free response portion. Couple notes for you guys. I'm going to be covering both the paper and the digital versions. So I'm going to try to go back and forth, but when we get to the Q&A section, obviously feel free to add any questions you might have about differences between the two if there's anything you're curious about that I didn't cover already. So on US history, you have 55 minutes to do 55 questions, which, across the board with AP exams is a reasonably quick pace considering how difficult these questions are. They really do often require very specific knowledge. One thing that's helped a lot, though, is that they break them out into 3 to 4 question sets based on what they call stimulus. So, as it says on the screen, right, that could be a text, either primary source or a secondary source. Could be a graph or table, just some measurement, some statistical measurement. Could be a map of a certain area. Could be multiple maps that you want to be comparing. Could be political cartoons. I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of those in your class as well. So they give you a little bit of background. However, a lot of times the answers are not entirely contained within the passages or the stimulus themselves. You have to bring in some outside information as well. So once you get through the multiple choice, you'll move into the free response. Now, some of you guys might be kind of softly shaking your heads because, yes, technically the short answers are considered part of the multiple choice, but they're really more of a free response answer, even though it's really just writing out a single sentence, maybe 2 sentences in some cases. I'm counting them as free response. Don't hate me for it. So free response altogether, including the short answers, is going to be 2 hours and 20 minutes. That's to answer a total of 5 questions. Now, slight modification that we'll get to for the digital exam this year for those of you guys taking it. It represents 60% of your score, the short answer being 20% of it, the DBQ and long essay are another 40%. For some reason that I am not privy to, the College Board actually makes it slightly. I think they do 21% on the first group of free response, and then 39 for the later portion instead. I might have those numbers backward, but it's off by 1% from what it normally would be. Not enough to actually impact how you guys sort of value the different sections and how you approach them. Important note though, so the long essay, the LEQ, where typically there's a group of questions offered, you get 3 different choices, you can choose from among them. That will be replaced on the digital version of the exam with instead 2 more short answer questions both based on stimulus. If you guys are on the College Board website, they actually break out for you exactly what types of stimulus you can expect for those two. In my opinion, it doesn't make a huge difference whether the stimulus is likely to be, say a map or a primary source, because obviously we have no way of knowing what the map or primary source is going to be. Your best bet, as always, is just to know your material inside out, to know it as well as you can, and in a way that you're prepared to use it flexibly, right? Use it in new situations and apply it in new contexts. A lot of times, the things we know, unfortunately, just never get tested directly on here, but as we'll see in multiple choice, they serve as a really valuable guide for what doesn't work at the very least. Okay, so let's talk about the scoring for a second. Again, this kind of surprises people a lot of the time. Well, so first off, again, if this is your first AP, you probably know how it's scored, 1 through 5. 4 or 5 is credit at most schools. A 3 is considered passing. Most schools will not give you credit for a 3. However, 4s and 5s will go for credit in most places in U.S. history. U.S. history in particular, a lot of times will require a 5, but it will place you out of, say, like an intro level history requirement or something like that. Now, this last bullet is the one I actually started talking about first, and that's the one that surprises people the most. You actually, to confidently score a 5, like to have a very, very sure bet of getting a 5, if you get 70% of the available points, that is, you get like a C minus on the multiple choice and if theoretically a C minus on the free response, you will get a 5. Historically, it's been closer to 60 to 65%. So that's why I'm saying safely to get a 5, you'll get a 70%. But if you're anywhere close to there, you're in very strong 4 to 5 range. So if nothing else, that should be a little bit of like, hey, we're all good. It's going to be okay. Even if you don't get your typical A on this particular test, you can get away with getting a much lower percentage of the questions right. And as we'll see, especially on the free response, this is very, very doable. If you know, even like basically, like if you can read the documents in the DBQ and you know at least a little bit of context surrounding most periods of American history, even just a small amount of context, you're almost guaranteed to get at least 4 points just by following the rubric carefully. Anything else you get beyond that is gravy. And keep in mind that 4 points is already getting you close to that 70% threshold anyway. Okay, so I should say I'm sure, or I'd like to say I'm sure, but I'm more so hopeful that your teachers have been kind of instilling in you the importance of these themes to the class. Think about the College Board's perspective for a second. They're trying to institute kind of a singular US history curriculum nationwide to many different classrooms, as expressed by many different teachers to many different students. So history can be taken in a lot of different directions. We can read history in many different senses. So the College Board tries to guide some of that reading, some of that sense of history by focusing on particular aspects of it and particular approaches to it. So these are the 8 themes that the College Board lists out, and a lot of classes will just, directly discuss each of these as the units move along. These are all ideas that you guys want to be fluent and comfortable with. So if you guys are not sure about like what any of these themes really mean, or you feel like your class hasn't really covered it, or you're a little bit shaky on like what sort of the important ideas or elements are of these, throw a question in the Q&A. I am happy to discuss it at the end of the presentation. So my main points on these, though, is that these are narratives, right? They're trends in U.S. development or development of other countries or larger scales in other classes. But here we're focused on trends in development in American culture. So these are ways that we can connect separate events. It's ways that we establish ideas like cause and effect, how one thing led to another. The truth is that studying history is kind of a murky proposition. If you're looking at it in kind of the most basic way, it's just a sequence of events, but we're constructing some level of causality, right? How did one thing cause another? And these are all different models that we can use for explaining how one thing led to another. Okay, we could say something like, technology spurred rapid industrial development, something like that. Or maybe we could make an argument that, something else entirely spurred rapid urbanization. There were other cultural forces at work. There were maybe other political forces. I don't know how strong that second argument would be. Definitely technology played a role. But just as an example, we could make different arguments, and this is really what the AP is testing. So if you know these well, these are a great starting point for how to begin setting up your essays, right? If you're in paper, your long essay, whether you're in paper or doing digital, your DBQs. Um, okay, so moving on to here, let's begin talking about the multiple choice in a little bit more specificity here. So like I said, you guys, a lot of my life revolves around test prep, in particular SAT and ACT. So I'm really into like optimizing your way of approaching questions. There's no substitute on this test for having a lot of knowledge of the subjects. The test will be very difficult if you really don't know your stuff. But even if you do know your stuff, or if you're kind of somewhere in the middle, using a smart process of elimination and knowing the structure of the test is really, really helpful. So first thing I want to be sure is clear about the way they have to write these is that wrong answers on this test, you guys, are wrong. And yes, forgive me the tautology, but it's not that they're just not as good. It's not like, oh, there's two possible answers, one's better than another. That's a really, really common misconception, because the College Board honestly could probably get sued if they wrote questions that way, because there would be room for reasonable disagreement. They could not say definitely that A is right and not C, just because C is somehow in their eyes a worse interpretation. As we said before, studying history is a bit of a murky proposition, right? Establishing how one thing led to another, or what really was the most important element of an era, that's all up to individual judgment in a lot of ways. And so, in other words, as I said there, who's to say that one interpretation is right and another wrong? The fun of history is having this back and forth dialogue about like what makes sense, constructing arguments, constructing stories about it that can kind of express some of this to us. But in multiple choice, at least, none of that can come into play because you don't get to explain your answer. What the College Board actually does on these is they make the murkiest and touchiest and closest answers technically wrong by doing a couple things. So number one, they plant errors in the wrong answers. Down at the bottom of the slide, I have examples of what those errors tend to be. So first, there will literally be contradictions, like they get historical events backwards, or they claim that something happened in a period that it didn't actually happen in. So be very alert to just factually false statements. That's really what I mean by contradictions there. Another thing might be that, like, if they've given you a primary source, maybe like they'll give an answer that is perhaps true or happened later on, but the passage itself directly contradicts it, even though it's not historically false. It might be something that the passage says the opposite of, for example. The other thing that I think a lot of people get stuck on, understandably, is that second bullet down at the bottom: absent ideas that would require a reach to justify. Studying this is a murky proposition. So a lot of times things are connected in non-obvious ways, but because of the way they have to write this test to avoid lawsuits, is that there needs to be some basis and substantiation for their answer. So if anything seems like a really, really long interpretation or is not related to what they're actually saying, what the College Board can very safely argue is that there's no support for that answer. It's possible, but there's no support for it. That counts as wrong. So their idea of the multiple choice is based on the stimulus and based on your knowledge of American history. What is the best option here? So if something is too unrelated to the stimulus in the first place, we count it as an absent idea, even if you could probably write a really fascinating historical analysis that does successfully connect them. Keep that in mind. There's no time for justification. They're not looking for reaches. The last thing is facts taken out of context. A lot of times these can be really appealing, especially when you're trying to churn fast through a tough test and you might be a little bit shaky on what exactly the question is asking. Always look out for answers like this that are true statements that are not actually responding to the question at hand. So that gets us back to that second item in the College Board dodges issue by section, where they word their questions very carefully. You want to be really conscientious about what exactly are they asking, how have they phrased it, what are they including in the question, what are they not including in the question. So if you guys are removing answers that are, either false statements or contradictions of some kind, anything that's really a reach that just isn't present in the stimulus in any way, that's going to leave us with multiple remaining answers. That's when you want to put on your context hat, go back to what the question is really asking, choose the one that accurately responds to this particular question. This is all way easier said than done. And I understand that this is tough to do and moving really fast. So be sure to be sure to do some untimed practice where you try to look at all the wrong answers and try to articulate to yourself what's actually incorrect about them. Are they contradicted? Are they absent, or are they taken out of context? And once you start to notice the patterns with these, it's going to be much easier to apply it quickly on the actual test. Okay, so in terms of sequencing the questions, there's a really big difference between paper and digital this year. Regardless of which one you're taking, it's key to keep moving. You have a pace of a minute per question, which honestly is way longer than you think. A lot of times when I'm meeting with my students and they're kind of worried about the pace, or I notice that they're rushing, I do an exercise that you can easily do with yourself. Stop everything you're doing, take out your phone or a stopwatch, start a 1 minute timer without looking at it, and sit there in silence and try to guess when the minute is up. You guys will inevitably be surprised because 30 seconds feels like a minute to most people, maybe 45 seconds for people that are really well tuned. Sometimes I even get students thinking it's been a minute after only like 15 seconds. But you want to get a feel for what a minute is like. It's enough time to think through a question for sure, and at least look for at least eliminate, like we said, contradictions and absent ideas, and start to analyze, although we can't spend all day on it. On paper, I recommend doing the test basically in two passes. So the first time going through, you only answer questions that you confidently know how to do, that you definitely know how to do. Out of 55 questions, it's fine if that's only 10 or 15 questions. That is no sweat. That is to be expected. On your second pass, you go through and you do everything that initially you were confused about or you weren't sure where to start. So if you read a question the first time, you don't even know what it's really asking or how it's related to the stimulus at all. Just immediately move on. Come back to it later on. If you still can't figure it out, put a guess quickly and get on to the next question. You want to be banking as many points. So remember, look, 55 questions at a 70% clip, you're looking at in the neighborhood of 35 to 40 questions. Very manageable, even if you only know 10 or 15 for sure. That means that you only need another 50% or so of the remaining questions. You need only figure out about half of the remaining ones to be doing at a 5 pace on this test. On digital, though, you guys will not be able to go back to earlier questions. This obviously throws a wrench in that plan. So it just means that you need to instead, if you definitely know how to question, definitely know how to do a question, go for it, do it. If you're shaky on what it's actually asking, give it another read. If you're still completely lost on it, cross off the answers that you know are definitely not correct, then quickly take a guess from the remaining options and move on to what's next. You'll almost always be able to see at least one or two answers that just don't make any sense at all. It's probably not worth it on an especially difficult question to sit there staring at it for much longer than it takes to identify what the two closest answers are. And if you just have no idea, just guess and keep going. There's likely to be much easier questions later. Okay, so I wanted to show you guys if you haven't seen this, again, this will be helpful, but I imagine most of you guys have seen what an individual stimulus plus questions look like. I wanted to take the opportunity to talk through a few of what the wrong answers are doing here. So with these three questions, this would give us about a 3-minute pace to work on these. I'm actually going to set a 3-minute timer right here and take a minute and go through these. This is directly from the College Board guide to the AP exam. So go ahead, read the stimulus, work the three questions, and while you're doing it, think about what's incorrect about the wrong answers. Let's reconvene in 3 minutes, and we will take a look at what's incorrect about them. Oh, is this kind of blurry for you guys? Let me see. I don't know if I can zoom in really. It might be a low, it might not be a great connection on my end then. Oops. Take about another minute, you guys. And again, focus on, really articulating to yourself what's wrong with the incorrect answers. Like, are they just false statements? Are they just absent ideas, or do they not respond to the question? Okay, cool. So uh, answers for these here. So we have B, then A, and then D. So I want to talk quickly through. I want to point out some stuff in number 5. I don't want to spend all day talking about sort of the nitty gritty details of these multiple choice questions. But if you guys are interested in discussing these further, let's do so in the Q&A. I'm happy to talk through what I think is sort of the most sort of concrete errors with the wrong answers in 6 and 7. But in 5, I would just point out that, so A, extension of commerce with Native Americans, that's an answer that for honestly for me and for like a lot of people, it might immediately like start to like create a little bit of paranoia where it's kind of like, wait, I didn't see any connection with Native Americans in the passage at all. Wait, is this somehow connected to like the Erie Canal? Oh, wait. Oh yeah, there were Native Americans up by the Hudson Bay. Okay, wait, maybe this like in a longer term way, this is linked. Don't go down that rabbit hole. If it doesn't talk in any way about Native Americans, even like more than even like one small step removed, it really just can't be that answer. That would just be way too speculative. That's an absent idea. Same thing with C, with the internal slave trade, not to mention that we're talking about New York City where, there slavery wasn't a big issue there. So finally, D, we've got the increase in semi-subsistence agricultural production. Kind of a little bit of tough vocabulary here. Semi-subsistence meaning like you're basically living on it, but you have some commercial element to your farming as well. But there's only references to the expansion of the city, rather than expansion of farms, right? If anything, it's going to be a decrease in semi-subsistence. So this would be an example where it's directly kind of contradicted by the passage. If there's growth in the city, that's going to mean a decrease in most types of, or it's going to mean a decrease in semi-subsistence agricultural production. So again, if you guys want to talk about 6 and 7, let's circle back around to those in the Q&A. I definitely want to be sure we have plenty of time to talk through the free response because like I said earlier on, I think that knowing the scoring for these is, or especially for the DBQ, is one of the most important things that you can have on this test. So first off, these are not school essays. Like in school essays where like going further into detail on one point or making a surprising connection between things, or, maybe some kind of like especially thorough portrait of a particular figure, or maybe like, uncovering like some unusual or little known information about someone that you found in doing research. That stuff is awesome. And like you guys keep doing that and keep working hard on essays that you're writing in class in that way. But on this test, unfortunately, those kind of things don't matter. Like even things like dates in your essay don't matter. It's not going to get you any more points to be able to say that something happened in a certain year versus another. So like, look, I mean, write a great essay. Doing things like writing dates, if you happen to know it, is good because maybe it kind of like plants a little bit of a seed. In your reader's head to help you get the sort of sophistication analysis point. We'll talk about that some more, for example. But for the most part, like focus on just hitting the key points that you need to in the rubric, which we'll look at in a minute. The other big thing is outlining. Hopefully you guys are doing a lot of outlining of these like as part of your practice as well. I'll give you some specific models that I use for outlining. Another thought is like you guys definitely want to think about your focusing on transitions. This is really more of a sophistication point consideration, but thinking about how ideas are connected is also really important for generating a coherent thesis which in turn is really important for making sure that when you're bringing up documents or when you're bringing up evidence, it actually does some work supporting your thesis, and it's not just saying true things about the documents. Your analysis of the documents needs to support your thesis. If you don't have a thesis that correctly ties ideas together, that's really hard to do. So short answer quickly, 9 points total, three-part questions. You've got the 7 points in the DBQ. You've got 6 points in the long answer. The substitute would be the 2 short answers with 3 points each. So the weighting would be the exact same. Keep in mind one more time, 70% is the safe benchmark for a 5. So if you're getting if you're getting a 6 or higher on the short answer, you're doing pretty well. If you're getting a 4 to 7 on the DBQ, you're doing okay. You're staying in there. If you're at 5 or higher, you're in good shape. And then on the long answer, if you're in the 4 to 5 range, you're also doing well, assuming your multiple choice is roughly in line with it. So, and like I said before, I think those are very achievable floors, given that you follow along with the rubric. Let's look at the short answer first. Like I said before, you're not going to gain much by writing a more thorough analysis than is needed on the short answer. You don't want to waste time writing out something that you're already expressing clearly, even in a single sentence. My suggestion with how to think about it is not that you're losing points in the way most tests in school are scored, but that you're gaining points for you're not losing points for doing things wrong, you're gaining points for doing things well. So if you know the answer, if you're like, okay, I definitely have this, keep your answer simple, 1 to 2 sentences max, go for it. However, if you're not sure of your answer, try explaining it a bit more, maybe even varying the way you're expressing it and explaining those different expressions. Maybe write more in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 sentences about it, moving quickly, of course, but 4 to 5 sentences, because if you can say a right thing somewhere in your longer expression, you're going to get the point. So you don't want to write a really short answer for something you're not sure about. If you're not totally sure of what you're saying is right, try saying it in a few different ways, try elaborating, try always putting a guess down. That never makes sense to leave something blank. Take a shot in the dark, say something you feel is obvious. That a lot of times even the obvious things or the things that kind of come to you intuitively after a year of studying this are going to be surprisingly correct and deserving of points in a lot of times. The other thing is think in terms of the themes. Like if you're really stuck on where to get started in a short answer question, they choose these passages to reflect those 8 themes. So try to connect it with, okay, wait, all right. So I know that this is something the one that we're going to look at is for example, about women's liberation. So that's something that ties in with several of the different themes, identity, politics. I mean, there's several different levels to it. So let's take a second and look over this short answer if you haven't seen it before. We don't have to worry about answering it this time. My apologies if it's still a little bit blurry. Take a second, look over it, maybe think about how you'd answer A, B, and C. But again, we can discuss these in the Q&A if you guys would like, but I don't want to dwell on it for too long. All right, cool. I'm going to keep rolling. Again, we can come back to this if you guys want. Just let me know in the Q&A. All right, moving on to the DBQ. This is kind of the monster of most history classes. Hopefully you guys have been doing a lot of these in class. If you're studying on your own, hopefully you've been also doing a fair amount of DBQ practice. I know it's really tough if you are studying on your own because you don't have a way of actually getting good outside assessment on it unless you're working with a tutor like me or someone else from Wyzant who might be able to actually give you really concrete specific feedback on where your DBQs would score, what you need to be doing differently to get the points. So first off, big thing is outlining. On the next slide, I'm going to go into how exactly to do that. The other big thing is you should plan your outline. You should plan your essay based on their rubric. There's really specific things that you got to do. One is a thesis. You guys know that. The other thing is to even write a single sentence before the thesis, contextualizing your argument, giving a little bit of background about what conditions were taking place or why the issue that they're asking about in this DBQ is relevant, important, or significant, or even just what was going on in the surrounding time period or in the surrounding region at that time period. So that kind of lays out for you all you need to do in, for example, an intro paragraph for this is contextualize, thesis, that's it. Writing anything else in the intro paragraph is not going to score you any more points. That's the way to go. Write a thesis, contextualize it, write a thesis. Don't worry about anything else. If you want to write an extra sentence, kind of smoothing things over, or you're like, really know your stuff and you're like, I am going to score a 7 on this essay if it's the last thing I do, then sure. Writing an extra sentence might help kind of hint that this is a very sophisticated essay that deserves a sophistication point. But on its face, writing more than 2, maybe 3 sentences in the intro is not going to score you any more points. So the next part is my suggestion, assuming you guys are shooting for a 4 or 5, is to use all the documents to support your argument. You will get 1 point for using 3 of them correctly. We'll talk about what it means to use them correctly, and 2 points for using 6 of them correctly. There's a good chance, though, that it will be hard that you will not score, that you will not earn a point for 1 of them. So give yourself a little bit of extra breathing room. Likewise, you get a point for using 1 piece of outside evidence. It's got to not only be true outside evidence, it also has to support your argument and be explained clearly. My suggestion is use 2 pieces of outside evidence in case 1 is not counted. You want to be sure to pick up that point. The other point that I think a lot of people overlook is in the analysis section, and it's explaining the relevance of some outside elements of the documents, context, likely audience, the point of view of it, or the purpose of the document. So not explaining the significance of the content of it, but these outside factors of it in addition to it. So you only have to pick 1, but if you do it for 3 documents, you will score an extra point. Therefore, I suggest you do it for 4, if not more of the documents, maybe 5 or so, to make sure that you actually do get that point. The other thing you could do, and I keep talking about this sophistication point, but probably the best way to do it, even without writing any more in other sections, is to have maybe a small paragraph or have a section in one of your paragraphs that qualifies your argument. If you guys haven't heard that term before, qualifying an argument means, okay, you've made one particular argument, but maybe you establish limits to it, right? So if I'm saying like, freedom is good, right? We might say, okay, well, freedom is good up to the point that your freedom harms other people. So that would be an example of me qualifying the argument. Okay, freedom is good up to the point that it harms others. That's qualification. The other thing within your thesis, make sure you take a real stance on the matter at hand. It can be a very nuanced stance. It can include elements of both sides, but you need to go one way or the other at the end of it. You can acknowledge some truth to the alternate position, but it actually needs to be very clear in what it's claiming beyond just restating what documents are already saying. As I said on the slide, you do not need to be somehow correct. There is no right or wrong side on this. They're not trying to get you to say any one thing. There are many valid responses to these DBQs. Frankly, an infinite number in theory. Naturally, they present themselves as kind of dichotomies one way or the other, but there are a huge range of possible responses. You just need to take a side. The last thing that is not part of the outlining, but is part of the writing for the DBQ, is that when you are going to introduce a document, it's fine to quote it, how you cite the document, whether you just put, document 3 in parentheses or just 3 in parentheses, that stuff doesn't matter. What you do need to be sure you do, though, is introduce them with a summary of their contents. That is part of earning the evidence points, is not just quoting a document, but accurately characterizing its contents. So it's really formulaic. You want to start with intro to the document that summarizes its content, quote the document, then explain how your document connects to your thesis. That last part is so important. And so often we leave it unstated. However, you need to do that to get the point for that document. That's why I say it's likely that, if you were just to do 6 documents, there's a good chance that you won't properly explain one of them. That's why you want to give yourself some wiggle room, but be sure to explain how the document connects to your idea, how it supports. It will feel like you're saying something obvious, but do it. It will earn you the point. Then last, you want to, so the last bit is to explain the context, audience, point of view, purpose, how that adds on another layer, how that might add on to the relevance to your thesis as well for the documents. It's okay to blend into one sentence the content and the point of view. Be sure that you distinguish them somewhat, make it easy for your reader to see that you're doing both things, and then also link them over to your thesis. ideally somewhat separately, but it's okay to blend them as long as they're both making independent connections to the thesis. And I can explain that a bit more in the Q&A if you guys want to talk about that kind of structure for how to talk about a document. All right, so my suggested outline right here is to figure out your thesis right off the bat and figure out your topic sentences. In my opinion, if you've figured out your thesis and your topic sentences, you've figured out the overall structure of your argument. Your topic sentences shouldn't just go straight into evidence, and they shouldn't be making detailed historical claims. They should be connecting general classes of evidence to the thesis. So if if your thesis is like, okay, freedom is good up until the point that it harms other people, maybe we'd have a paragraph about, okay, here are the benefits of freedom. So we would say, freedom is good because it has a lot of benefits, right? So that's a general class of evidence. Then we're going to list out some benefits of freedom. In the second paragraph, we're going to say freedom is also good because tyranny is bad, right? So then we're going to list out some examples of how tyranny is bad. That's a class of evidence as tyranny is bad versus freedom is good. So versus freedom has benefits. So those are two different classes of evidence that we want to be using. You guys should be doing the same thing on here. Where your thesis has different types of evidence for it, that's how you want to organize the different documents. So 2 or 3 body paragraphs is totally fine. Just depends how many examples you use in each one. I usually go with 2 paragraphs just because it's a bit simpler and you don't have to do quite as much planning that way. So if you do 2 paragraphs, you should be using 3 to technically 4 pieces of evidence per paragraph if you want to be using all 7. My suggestion on writing a thesis, a lot of times I think people start with their thesis and then they run into a problem where they're like, wait, how the hell am I supposed to use half of these documents because they don't support my thesis? They go against it, right? Or they just seem entirely unrelated. My suggestion for dealing with that is to think of this almost like a game of stringing together all the evidence. How can you encapsulate all the evidence? How can you make a statement that reflects the elements of truth that are in all of them? Many times this will take the form, as you guys have probably heard, of an although statement. So although sometimes freedom can prevent good coordination, freedom is ultimately good up until the point that it starts to harm other people. So that although it can harm coordination part, or although it can sometimes limit coordination, that might be something that we want to acknowledge throughout our essay, perhaps by voicing the opinions of the documents that state that point of view, that freedom is bad because it doesn't coordinate opinion, or it doesn't coordinate action. So keep in mind that, like I say at the end, you are allowed to disagree with the documents. You just have to say why you disagree. You have to analyze maybe how the point of view is biased, right? Or maybe how the audience of it is a group that's not really representative of what the larger principle that the document represents. It's okay to say why a document does not ultimately make a strong enough point about your thesis, or why it's ultimately less important than other things. You can even probably get away with, articulating a document fully and just explaining how it disagrees with you, explaining how it disagrees, and then transitioning by saying, however, that is less significant than the information contained in this other document. So even fully explaining one, then just claiming it's less significant, that counts as using the 2 documents and explaining how they're connected to your thesis as well. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about this rubric. I want to be sure that you guys actually know exactly what points I'm referring to in here. So we've got the first off, we've got that thesis point at the top. We've got the contextualization. Like I said, go contextualization, then thesis at a minimum in your opening paragraphs. You already won 2 points, even if you do nothing else in the essay. Notice in the evidence section, this is what I was talking about using 3 versus 6 of the documents. Look in the decision rules column though, you guys. So it says to earn 2 points, it must describe the content from 6 documents, and it must use it to support an argument. So that's that key sentence where after you quote it, where you explain, even if it's obvious, how it supports your argument. Last, evidence beyond the document. It's got to be a specific event, a specific person, a specific instance, or maybe you can get away with a really specific trend, but it should probably be tied to a specific event or period or purpose. Last, so the analysis and reasoning section. The first point is that one I was saying about context, point of view, purpose, or audience. Again, if you're doing it for 4 to 5, it's a pretty safe bet that you'll actually score on it for at least 3 of them. Then the last point is that sophistication point, demonstrates a complex understanding of the historical development. A lot of times this is what you get by writing the although sentence, is you're showing that there's a nuance to it. There's 2 sides and you've successfully disproven the other by balancing both. Okay, cool. So long essay question. I'm going to be brief on this one because I want to be sure we get to have some time to answer you guys' questions. So long essay, structurally very similar to a DBQ. You just don't get any evidence to bring in. You do get to choose from 3 topics. My suggestion is you pick the topic that you know the most specific examples about, not necessarily the one you have like the strongest feelings about, or the one that like you kind of feel like one side is most clear on. It's more, you get more points for bringing in evidence than you do for like having a really than for having like a somehow correct argument about it. So it's pretty easy to come up with a thesis and contextualization in general. It's harder to tie the evidence to it. So if you start with your evidence and then work back and then think about, okay, I know all these things, then take a step back to get to your thesis and be like, okay, I'll figure out a thesis that lets me talk about the things I know from this period. Like I said before, there's no benefit to having specific dates on this. I know a lot of times people will be like, oh, I can't remember what year that happened. I don't want to say the wrong year. If you don't know the year, just don't say it. If you do, sure, it's just not necessarily going to do anything for you. In terms of outline for the long essay question, pretty similar to the DBQ, I would say, same thing. 2 to 3 topics, thesis plus 2 to 3 topic sentences, outline your argument with your classes of evidence, then 2 examples for each paragraph, make them specific, no generalizations. Finally, again, this is kind of an angle on getting that sophistication point, but if you have a concluding idea that you can kind of use as like extra context and then close out with it as well, maybe show like a sense of narrative about it, that's really useful for for scoring that sophistication point. I think this time, yes, I was saying like pick the topic that you know more evidence about. But this time, when you write your thesis, you want to think about, okay, how do I want to use these topics? How do I want to use the evidence that I know more about? Because when the evidence is not being specifically stated in a certain text, it's a bit more flexible. We can use it for more purposes this way. So that I know that point might have been slightly confusing. So select based on what you have more evidence about, but then choose the thesis that you basically agree with or you think is right, and then explain how the examples you do know about are connected to that thesis. It's just kind of too open-ended, I think, to try to construct a thesis just based on like 4 examples you have about a particular topic or period. It could go too many different ways. So I think it's a little bit better to start with kind of your thoughts on the matter, and then relate the evidence in a way that that reflects that thesis. So this should look pretty familiar. The only difference is that you don't get an evidence point for bringing in outside, or the difference is that you don't have the numbers of documents. You don't have evidence for outside. You don't have points for outside evidence because it's all outside evidence. Again, part of the reason that we're choosing 4 pieces of evidence here, in principle, you only really need 1 piece. In theory, you could write an awesome analysis of just 1 piece of historical evidence, but it's a safer bet to not put all your eggs in one basket and have 4 different pieces that you're connecting to your thesis. That's going to guarantee that you get the full 2 points. For the evidence. Again, you will only get 1 point if you just name a historical event. You will get 2 points if you name the historical event and explain how it supports your thesis. A lot of times that's way more obvious than it sounds. So first paragraph structure is the same thing. I would suggest 2 body paragraphs with 2 pieces of evidence. Analysis and reasoning, again, it's like as long as you're writing a thesis, most of the time you're going to probably be able to get the first analysis point, as long as you're explaining actual things that happened and you have a thesis and your argument is continuous throughout. If you write topic sentences, you're going to get that first point. The second point is, again, that sophistication point, though. So that's where maybe things like years help kind of prime your reader for like thinking that you know your stuff really well. Maybe a little bit more balance and nuance in the way you present your argument is going to be helpful there. But I think the best way to do it is just by structuring your thesis in a way that's qualified right off the bat. All right, cool. So By the way, video, if you guys ever want to rewatch these, it will be available on Wyzant. I want to transition over to the Q&A portion of this right now. So like I said, I'm happy to revisit anything from the slides. I'm happy to jump back on those multiple choice questions. I'm happy to go to a few of the, I'm happy to talk about any essay prompts you guys had that were difficult. So throw your questions in the Q&A. I'll start answering the stuff that's already come up. So the first one actually popped up a bit earlier. So it was a question, I think, about the DBQ, if I'm not mistaken. So the question is, does it matter whether you do contextualization by pre-context in the intro or post-context in a conclusion? If you only know one or the other, will it score the same? It will score the same either way. I think, it's sort of preferable to have pre-context, what was happening maybe before, I would guess, because it sets the background. Or actually, let me take a step back. Like, I'm not sure that you only want to think about context in general as like linear in that way, where like context is what happened before it or what happened after it. Context is also the things that are happening simultaneous with whatever the topic of the DBQ or the long essay question is. So it's not necessarily you want to say what led up to it or what happened after it. It could just be like a bigger picture of what was going on in the world at the time or in the United States at the time, or where these documents or where this discussion takes place in the context of other things that were happening simultaneously. But yes, to be clear, establishing what happened before, as you called it, pre-context, that is something that would count as contextualization. Same thing with what these events led to, and naturally it probably does make more sense to write about that in a conclusion. So I would say, like, if you're in that situation and you only know the post context, you're like, wait, what else do I put in my intro paragraph? Maybe just a more general statement about the topic at hand. It probably won't score you the contextualization on its point, but it will kind of give you a slightly smoother segue into your thesis. But honestly, it's not the end of the world. If you're putting post context in the concluding paragraph, it's not the end of the world to just have your thesis be your entire first paragraph. Another question is, will there be deductions for wrong answers? Great question. So, again, it's kind of how you think about it. Like, if you think of yourself as starting with all the points and then you like miss out on some, then sure, like, yeah, obviously on the multiple choice, there's deductions for wrong answers. I prefer to think of it as gaining points though. And maybe that's just because the threshold for scoring a 5 is so relatively low compared to what you guys have to do on your tests at school. On the free response, I really would encourage you to think about it as gaining points, not as losing them. They're not going to take points off because you make a false statement in the short answers. It's very binary. It's, hey, did you say a correct answer to this or did you not? So if you did, you get a point, even if there were mistakes or incorrect things elsewhere in your answer to that question. So that's kind of why I'm saying, if you're not sure, elaborate, say more about it, write 4 to 5 sentences, express your idea in a few different ways, kind of like try to justify it a little bit more, and you may just be able to talk them into giving you a point, even if you're not totally sure that what you're saying is necessarily correct. On the DBQ, like the rule that they have, I'm reciting this from memory, but the rule that they have is if there are historical errors to the point that they interfere, DBQ and LAQ, if there are historical errors to the point that they interfere with the ability of your evidence to connect with the thesis, or they interfere with your ability to present an argument, like they undermine what you're saying because like you're just not saying anything that's actually accurate, then they can dock you one of the evidence points. But again, it's not like docking you the evidence point. It's more like you just never earned it in the first place. Although, yeah, like I guess if you did 6 documents correctly, but said a bunch of historically false things that were massively distracting, I would say, yeah, I guess you could think of that as losing a point. Hopefully that kind of covers the full gamut of possibilities there. Okay, cool. We had another question come in. Question is, in a stimulus-based SAQ, do you provide evidence that is provided in the stimulus, or do you need to bring in your own evidence? To be clear, you guys do not need to provide evidence in the short answer questions. So in the short answer, your answers can just be one to two sentences stating an answer to the question. You do not need to go beyond that. Once in a while, that that they'll use words like contrast or explain, or they'll use the words contrast in like the longer essays a lot. But in they might say something like explain in one of the short answer questions, but even that just means give a brief amount of background on the topic, not necessarily like bringing in actual evidence per se. um, I think, like, the idea is that your answer is reflective of the evidence. I know that's kind of vague, but like your like the thing that you're providing as a response to the short answer is probably what the it like they're imagining that it's somehow like it comes from your knowledge of the evidence behind it. Maybe that makes a little bit more sense to say it that way. But yeah, like you really just should be answering the question like in a straightforward way. If you provide some evidence, again, that might help move the needle if it's not really clear what you're saying the first way you expressed it. So it can't hurt, but you definitely don't need to provide evidence either from outside or from inside the passage. Again, I hope that's not like dodging the question, but basically, yeah, like if you want to quote the stimulus, you definitely can. You can point out like just to kind of justify your answer a bit more if you're feeling shaky on it. If you're feeling shaky on your answer, as I said, elaborate, justify it, quote the documents, but that's not technically needed to actually get the point. Does that cover it? Cool, cool. Um, all right, good stuff, you guys. So I can hang out for about another minute if you guys have any more questions that you wanted to know. But other than that, if any of you guys happen to be taking AP Language and Composition, by the way, we're about to do a presentation on that shortly. I believe you guys can find it's on the same Wyzant page, I believe, on Eventbrite. I think we just linked to the full schedule right there. So if you guys are taking that class, I'm going to be doing a fairly similar presentation that has some amount of overlap with this one in terms of the strategy, but has some stuff that's really specific to that test as well. And if you guys have any questions for me, like anything really specifically, or you guys are curious about particular topics, or you want to run some essays by me, feel free to reach out to me on my Wyzant profile. They just linked it in the chat below. And with that, if there's no other questions, thank you guys very much for joining today. It was a pleasure kind of talking with you guys, and I wish you guys the best of luck on your test, whether you're taking it in paper or online. Like I said, any questions, just let me know. Cheers.